Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz had 15 children. 15. In an age when royal parenthood was as much political strategy as it was personal joy, this was considered a triumph. A dynasty secured, a line unbroken, a nation reassured. The portraits commissioned to mark these arrivals show a family of almost theatrical perfection. The good King George, the devoted Queen, the rosy-cheeked children arranged around them like living proof of everything a monarchy should be. But behind those portraits, behind the gilded walls of Windsor and the formal gardens of Kew, a rather different story was unfolding. A story that the portraits were never commissioned to tell. Because for 6 of those 15 children, the daughters, the girls, the ones who would never wear the crown, life inside the most famous family in the world was something closer to a very elegant, very comfortable, and very inescapable cage. Their names were Charlotte, Augusta, Elizabeth, Mary, Sophia, and Amelia. 6 women who were, by any measure of age, among the most eligible in the world. 6 women who were educated, accomplished, witty, and, by the accounts of those who knew them, often rather wonderful company. And 6 women who, for reasons that had everything to do with the man they called father and the woman they called mother, spent the most vital decades of their lives doing very little at all. This is the story of 2 of them. It contains a secret baby, a blackmail attempt, a rumour so scandalous it circled the newspapers of London, and a death so devastating that it broke a king's mind permanently. It is, in every sense, a story that history has given far too little attention. To understand what happened to Sophia and Amelia, and why it happened the way it did, you have to first understand the world they were born into. And that world, at its heart, was shaped by 2 very powerful forces. A father who loved his daughters so much he could not bear the thought of losing them, and a mother who needed them so completely that she turned that need into something approaching a system of control. George III was, by the standards of his age and his family, a genuinely good man. He was faithful to his wife, devoted to his children, and committed to the idea of a respectable domestic monarchy after the scandalous excesses of his predecessors. He had watched his own sisters dispatched into unhappy foreign marriages and was determined that his daughters would be spared that particular fate. The problem was that in protecting them from bad marriages, he gradually, and perhaps without ever fully acknowledging it, began protecting them from any marriages at all. As he would write, with a candour that probably felt more tender to him than it reads to us, "I cannot deny that I have never wished to see any of them marry. I am happy in their company and do not in the least want a separation." Queen Charlotte's motivations were rather more complicated. She was a deeply intelligent woman, operating within the very narrow constraints available to a queen consort, and as George's bouts of mental illness, what we now believe to have been the hereditary condition porphyria, began to recur and deepen, she found herself increasingly dependent on her daughters as companions, confidants, and emotional anchors. Her need for them became, over time, all-consuming. She managed their schedules, supervised their correspondence, and made it quietly but unmistakably clear that their primary duty was to her. The result was a household that the princesses themselves described, with a bitterness only half disguised by humour, as the Nunnery. They were among the best educated women in England, tutored in languages, history, music, art, geography, and needlework by carefully chosen instructors, and yet, for entertainment, their mother read sermons to them. They were taught to paint with real skill and then spent their afternoons embroidering. Visitors were carefully vetted. Men, beyond pages, equerries, and a small number of approved attendants, were simply not part of their world. On one occasion, Sophia wrote to her brother George, the Prince of Wales, that her days were so deadly dull, she wished she were a kangaroo. On another, she told him she sometimes wondered why he did not simply vote for putting us in a sack and drowning us in the Thames. The Prince of Wales was their closest ally and most sympathetic correspondent throughout these years. He felt genuinely, deeply sorry for them, and more than once attempted to negotiate a loosening of the restrictions, inviting them to events, petitioning the Queen on their behalf, trying to secure them independent incomes and some measure of adult freedom. For the most part, he was unsuccessful. Queen Charlotte wielded her trump card with great effectiveness. The suggestion that any disruption to the household routine risked destabilizing the king's already fragile mental state. It was an argument very difficult to counter, and she was not above deploying it whenever the situation required. So the years passed. Suitors came and were turned away. German princes inquired and received no encouragement. The elder sister, Charlotte, the Princess Royal, eventually married at 31, late by the standards of any era, and left for Württemberg with what her family described as almost indecent relief. The remaining 5 stayed, and stayed, and stayed. By the time anyone paid serious attention to the question of husbands for the younger girls, the window for most of them had quietly closed. They were not the only casualties of this arrangement, but they were its most visible ones. Princess Sophia was born on the 3rd of November, 1777, the 12th child and 5th daughter of George and Charlotte. By the accounts of those who knew her well, she was a delightful, occasionally volatile girl, pretty, passionate, and possessed of an emotional intensity that the rigid structures of court life did very little to channel constructively. Her biographer, Christopher Hibbert, described her in her young adulthood as a delightful though moody girl, pretty, delicate, and passionate. She adored her father. She was rather more frightened of her mother, and like all her sisters, she grew up in a world where the only men she encountered with any regularity were the small number permitted to move within the royal household. One of those men was Major General Thomas Garth. He was the king's chief equerry, a position of considerable responsibility and regular proximity to the royal family. He was also 56 years old. He was, by contemporary accounts, not a physically prepossessing man. Small in stature and marked across his face by a large purple birthmark that drew immediate attention from anyone who encountered him. Sophia's sister, Mary, who had a gift for a phrase, called his birthmark the purple light of love. The courtier and diarist Charles Greville called him, rather more bluntly, a hideous old devil. And yet, despite everything, the age gap of 33 years, the birthmark, the social impossibility of the whole arrangement, Sophia fell in love with him. Not quietly, not cautiously, but with the full force of a young woman who had been kept from the world so completely that when feeling arrived, it arrived without any of the usual filters. A lady-in-waiting recorded it plainly. The princess was so violently in love with him that everyone saw it. She could not contain herself in his presence. The diarist Greville, who was not a sympathetic observer, wrote that Sophia and her sisters were secluded from the world, mixing with few people, their passions boiling over and ready to fall into the hands of the first man who could get at them. It was a harsh observation. It was also, in its essential mechanics, not entirely wrong. The details of what happened next are pieced together from letters, diaries, and accounts by people who closely monitored the movements of the royal household. What appears to have happened is this. During the winter of 1799, while both Sophia and Garth were residents at Windsor Castle, they became lovers. The opportunity seems to have arisen on an evening when the King and Queen were in London, leaving Sophia at the Queen's Lodge, where her bedroom was, rather significantly, directly below Garth's. 9 months later, in the summer of 1800, the consequences of that evening became impossible to conceal. Sophia was sent to Weymouth, a seaside town that the royal family used regularly for health cures, on the official pretext that she was recovering from dropsy, a catch-all diagnosis that was usefully vague and required plenty of rest and sea air. What actually happened there, on or around the 5th of August 1800, is that Sophia gave birth to a son. The infant was christened at the local parish church 11 days later, recorded in the register as Thomas Ward, a stranger, the period term for a foundling placed with his adoptive parents, Samuel and Charlotte Sharland. Samuel Sharland was a tailor in Weymouth and a colonel in the local volunteers. The arrangements had clearly been made in great haste. There is evidence to suggest that Sophia did not fully realise she was pregnant until she was already far along, which would explain the barely controlled chaos of the arrangements surrounding the birth. The family, or at least most of it, knew. Queen Charlotte knew. Several of the ladies-in-waiting knew. What the king was told, if he was told anything, was that his daughter had been unwell with dropsy and was now recovering. Legend has it that when George III noticed Sophia gaining weight in the months before the birth, he was informed it was the result of too much roast beef and that sea bathing would sort it out. Whether he believed this or simply preferred not to know is one of those questions that history declines to answer cleanly. General Garth eventually adopted the boy, giving him his name, paying for his education at Harrow School, and finding him a position in the army with the 15th King's Hussars, Garth's own regiment. The child was known as Tommy. Sophia reportedly visited him occasionally over the years, though always with the utmost discretion. She never married. The birth of an illegitimate child, in the world she inhabited, meant that the already narrow possibility of a respectable marriage had collapsed entirely. For a princess of the blood royal, there was simply no recovering from it, at least not openly. For many years, the secret was held. Then, in 1829, the arrangement began to unravel from within. General Garth, believing himself to be dying, entrusted Tommy with an iron box. Inside that box were the letters and documents that established beyond a reasonable doubt that Sophia was his mother. Garth recovered, but Tommy kept the box. And when, the following year, he found himself heavily in debt and facing prison, he decided to use what he had. What followed was, by any measure, an absolute disgrace, though historians have debated ever since exactly which parties deserve the most blame for it. Tommy approached the royal family with his evidence, seeking money in exchange for silence. The royal family, through intermediaries, offered him £3,000 for the box. Tommy handed over the box. The royal family took it and declined to pay him. Tommy, having been comprehensively outmaneuvered, went to the newspapers. The press, never slow to seize an opportunity of this kind, began to dig. And what they dug up was considerably worse than anything Tommy had originally put on the table, because somewhere in the gossip and rumour circulating around the story, a name emerged that turned a scandal into something altogether more alarming. The name was Ernest, Duke of Cumberland. Ernest was Sophia's brother, one of the more unpopular princes of an era not short of unpopular princes. His enemies, and he had accumulated a considerable number of them, had long been looking for something to destroy him with. The suggestion now spreading through political circles and newspaper columns was that the father of Sophia's son was not General Garth at all, but Ernest, that the relationship had not been a love affair with an elderly equerry, but something far darker, between a brother and sister. The rumour was, most historians believe, almost certainly false. It appears to have been started, or at least amplified, by Sophia's sister-in-law, Caroline of Brunswick, who had her own considerable reasons to cause trouble for the royal family, and who was not, by any measure, a reliable source. The Duke of Kent believed it. Several others did too. But the evidence points clearly and consistently to Garth as the father. The timing, the access, the adoption of the child, Garth's own tacit acknowledgement, and Ernest, for all his faults, was never conclusively linked to anything beyond the gossip. George IV, by then on the throne, was livid. The whole affair had been handled with the kind of spectacular incompetence that made a bad situation considerably worse. Sophia, throughout all of it, remained silent. In public and in private, she said nothing. Not a word in her correspondence, not a hint in any letter that has survived. Whether this silence was dignity, grief, or simply the exhausted resignation of a woman who had long ago learned that there was very little point in saying anything, is impossible to know. Charles Greville, who recorded so much of the gossip of the age, wrote of her shortly after her death in 1848. She was a very clever, well-informed woman, but one who never lived in the world. He meant it as an observation. It reads rather more like an epitaph. Before we get to Amelia and her story, which is, if anything, even more heartbreaking than Sophia's, I wanted to take a moment to say something to those of you who've been watching History Roadshow for a while now. This channel runs on the same thing it always has: research, a genuine love of history, and the support of people who find these stories as compelling as I do. If you'd like to be a bigger part of keeping that going, we do have a Patreon. The link is in the description below. Supporters there get early access to videos and the knowledge that they're directly helping stories like this one get made properly. If that's not for you right now, absolutely no obligation. Liking the video and leaving a comment does more than most people realize. But if you've been thinking about it, now is a lovely moment to take a look. Right, back to Windsor, back to the 1800s, and back to a young woman named Amelia, who deserves to be remembered far more than she is. Princess Amelia was born on the 7th of August, 1783, at the Royal Lodge in Windsor. She was the 15th and last child, the 6th and youngest daughter, and she arrived in the world just 3 months after the death of her brother Octavius, a 4-year-old who had been her father's particular favourite among his sons. George III had been devastated by Octavius's death, and into that devastation, almost as if by design, came Amelia. Small, beautiful, irresistible. The king transferred to her everything he had felt for the boy he had lost, and rather more besides. He called her Emily. He sat on the floor and played with her when she was small. He wrote her letters that overflow with a tenderness that the formal prose of the age struggles to contain. She was, quite simply, the light of his life, and she seems to have known it and loved him back with equal fervour. She was also, by the accounts of virtually everyone who encountered her, quite extraordinarily good company. Clever, warm, funny, and possessed of a directness that was either charming or alarming, depending on the occasion. At the age of 2, she apparently so exhausted a famous portrait painter with her inability to sit still that he declined ever to paint her again. But Amelia had been born into the same household as her sisters, and what had constrained them would constrain her too. She was 15 years old in 1798 when she first noticed a persistent pain in her knee, a pain she tried, with characteristic determination, not to make a fuss about. She wrote to her father from Worthing, where she had been sent to take the sea air. Certainly the vapour and warm sea bath are of use, and therefore I hope that I shall be able to assure you that I am better. It was a sweet letter. It was also the first sign of something that would define, and eventually end, her life. The diagnosis, as the years progressed and the symptoms refused to resolve, was tuberculosis, a disease that in 1798 had no cure, no reliable treatment, and a very unpredictable course. It was during one of these seaside health cures in 1801 in Weymouth that a second story began, one that would run alongside the illness for the rest of Amelia's life, and that would be, in its way, every bit as painful. Among those attending her at Weymouth was Colonel the Honourable Charles Fitzroy, an equerry of her father's, and the second son of the first Baron Southampton. He was 21 years older than Amelia. He was also, by every account, a decent, kind, and thoroughly unsuitable man. Unsuitable not because of any defect of character, but because of a very specific piece of legislation that her own father had put before Parliament almost 30 years earlier. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 required all descendants of George II under the age of 25 to obtain the King's consent before marrying, and those over 25 to give notice to the Privy Council. In practice, for a princess who was the reigning monarch's youngest daughter and whose father's mental stability was fragile enough to be cited as a reason not to do anything that might upset him, it meant that marriage without consent was essentially impossible. And consent to Charles Fitzroy, a commoner with no royal blood and no title beyond what his father's barony afforded him, was never going to be forthcoming. Amelia knew this. She loved him anyway. She signed her letters A.F.R. Amelia Fitzroy. She told her brother Frederick that she considered herself, in every sense that mattered to her, already married to him. The Queen was aware of the attachment and, in what reads now as an act of almost architectural cruelty, chose not to inform the King on the grounds that the knowledge might worsen his mental state. So Amelia could not marry the man she loved, could not tell her father the reason why, and could not even seek his sympathy without risking the accusation that she had endangered his health. She was trapped in a silence of other people's making, held there by the same instinct for protection that had trapped her sisters in the nunnery. The years between 1801 and 1810 were a long, slow diminishment. Amelia's tuberculosis advanced and retreated and advanced again, following the unpredictable course of the disease with particular cruelty. The treatments of the age, bleeding, blistering, leeches, sea bathing, beef tea, and calomel, were applied with the dedicated attention of people who genuinely wanted to help and had almost nothing useful to offer. In 1808, she suffered a severe attack of measles that left her already weakened body considerably more fragile. By 1810, when she was 26, it was becoming clear to everyone, except possibly her father, that she was running out of time. That summer, she was sent to Weymouth one last time, a final attempt at recovery by the sea that had sometimes, in earlier years, brought her a little relief. It brought none. She returned to Windsor in the autumn and was settled at Augusta Lodge, near the Royal Lodge, where she had been born, and where her sister Mary, who had devoted herself to Amelia's care with a dedication that anyone who has ever nursed a beloved sibling will immediately recognize, became her constant companion and nurse. Amelia called her sister Dearest Minnie. Mary called Amelia everything. In October 1810, Amelia was seized by erysipelas, the infection known as St. Anthony's fire, which inflamed the skin with a vivid, painful rash. It spread from her face downward. The King, who had been questioning her physicians at 7 o'clock every morning and several more times throughout the day, was told that there was no longer any hope. He continued to ask. Amelia lay in her bed and made arrangements that she had known for some time she would need to make. She had a mourning ring commissioned from the court jewellers, Rundle, Bridge & Company. It was set with a lock of her hair, held under a crystal, surrounded with diamonds. She had it sent to her father. When the King received it, he burst into tears, not only because of what it meant, but because of the extraordinary tenderness of the gesture. His youngest child, his Emily, dying in her bed 3 miles away, had thought of him, had wanted him to have something of her, had arranged it herself while she still could. She made one last attempt to be with the man she loved. She asked her doctor, Sir Henry Halford, to approach the appropriate authorities and seek permission for her marriage to Fitzroy. Sir Henry Halford refused, with a directness that he clearly believed was kindness. Such a marriage, he told her, would entail great wretchedness upon yourself and misery upon all the royal family for ages to come. The blow to the king's peace of mind, he added, must be so heavy as to endanger the loss of His Majesty's happiness, but also of his health. It was the same argument that had been used against the sisters their entire lives. It was used on Amelia for the last time while she was dying. On the 2nd of November, 1810, at noon, Amelia died. She was 27 years old. Her sister Mary was at her bedside. Her last words, passed to Fitzroy through Mary's letter to him, were these: "Tell Charles I die, blessing him." Fitzroy was not invited to the funeral. He bore his grief privately, sustained by the letters of the siblings who understood what he had meant to her. He received her entire estate, everything she owned, everything she could give, because she had dictated her will accordingly. The effect of Amelia's death on her father was immediate, total, and permanent. George III had been walking a very narrow line between stability and crisis for years, his mental health maintained by routine, by familiar faces, and by the presence of the children he loved. Amelia's loss broke something in him that never healed. He descended within weeks into a state of derangement from which he never again emerged. He began to hallucinate. He heard voices. He talked for hours without stopping. He believed, in some of his more lucid moments, that Amelia was not dead at all, that she had merely gone to live in Hanover with a husband and children of her own, enjoying the life she had never been permitted to have in England. In February 1811, his eldest son George became Prince Regent, effectively ending the old king's reign, though George III would live for another 9 years, in a private world of his own at Windsor, cared for but no longer truly present. His brother, the Duke of York, visited him regularly. Almost no one else did. He had outlived the daughter he could not recover from losing, and he spent his remaining years in a kind of perpetual, wandering grief, convinced, in his better moments, that she was somewhere, happy, if only someone would tell him where. George, the future George IV, was so affected by his sister's death that after her funeral, he could never again sleep in a room that was not lit by several wax candles. More than 3 years later, he still burst into tears at the mention of her name. He is not often described as a sympathetic figure, and in many respects he was not. But in this, at least, he was entirely human. Charlotte, Augusta, Elizabeth, Mary, Sophia, Amelia. 6 women who were, by every conventional measure, among the most privileged people in England, and who spent their lives in a gilded captivity so complete that the only men available to fall in love with were the men paid to stand in their fathers' hallways. 2 of them, Sophia and Amelia, paid for that captivity in ways that the portraits on the palace walls were never designed to record. Sophia's son Tommy lived until 1875. He never received a clear public acknowledgement of who his mother was, and his attempts to force one ended in the humiliation of the Iron Box affair and a life that became, in several respects, as complicated as the circumstances of his birth. Sophia herself died in 1848, blind and elderly, at Kensington Palace, surrounded, as she had always been, by other people's arrangements. Amelia's mourning ring is in the royal collection. It is very small and very beautiful. The hair inside it, the last thing she could give her father before she died, is still perfectly preserved. If this story has stayed with you, if these women have stayed with you, I'd love to know which of them you find most compelling. Leave me a name in the comments. Every one of these princesses has a story that deserves more than a footnote, and your comments genuinely shape what comes next. I'll see you in the next one.